There is something quietly unsettling about the moment you realize a memory you have carried for years, one you would stake your reputation on, one you have recounted at dinner tables, and in therapy sessions, and in arguments that mattered, is not true. Not distorted, not slightly off, but wrong in its architecture. Wrong in a way that the wrongness itself reveals something about the mind that made it. The brain, for all its celebrated complexity, is not a camera. It never was. And yet we live as though it were, navigating relationships, courtrooms, personal identities, and moral judgments, on the assumption that what we remember is, at minimum, an honest approximation of what happened. That assumption is more fragile than almost anyone is prepared to accept. Memory researchers have been trying to explain this fragility for decades. But the difficulty is not scientific. The difficulty is cultural. The metaphor of memory as recording runs so deep in ordinary life that even people who intellectually understand that memory is reconstructive still feel, in their gut, that their own memories must be the exception. The research says otherwise, and it does so not through abstract theory, but through controlled experiments, courtroom disasters, neuroimaging studies, and the accumulated wreckage of wrongful convictions. The evidence is not subtle. What remains subtle is the mechanism, the precise, elegant, almost beautiful way the brain manufactures convincing falsehoods from real experience. To understand where memory goes wrong, it helps to understand, at the most fundamental level, what memory is actually doing when it is working correctly. The hippocampus, a paired structure tucked beneath the cerebral cortex in the medial temporal lobe, plays a central role in the formation of episodic memories, the kind that carry a sense of time, place, and self-reference. When an event occurs, the brain does not store a unified file. Instead, it encodes fragments. The sensory components are distributed across the cortex, with visual information processed in the occipital and temporal regions, auditory information in the auditory cortex, emotional weight assigned partly through the amygdala. The hippocampus acts as an index, binding these fragments together and maintaining the associations between them. When you later retrieve a memory, the hippocampus does not play back a recording. It reconstructs the experience by reassembling those distributed fragments, and it does so in real time, every single time you remember. This is where the first vulnerability appears. Each act of retrieval is also necessarily an act of reconstruction, and reconstruction is subject to what is currently present in the mind, the current knowledge, the current emotional state, the current social context, the current understanding of what happened afterward. The memory of an event is always filtered through everything that has happened since. This is not a flaw, it is a design. The brain is built for adaptive function, not archival accuracy. A memory that updates itself in light of new information is, in most circumstances, more useful than a memory that remains frozen at the moment of encoding. The problem arises when that updating introduces errors that feel indistinguishable from the original. Daniel Schachter, a cognitive neuroscientist at Harvard who has spent much of his career mapping the failures of human memory, categorized these errors into what he called the 7 sins of memory, grouping them loosely into sins of omission, where information is lost or blocked, and sins of commission, where incorrect information is either produced or unwantedly intrudes. The commission errors are the ones that generate the deepest unease, because they involve the brain actively generating content that was never part of the original experience. Misattribution, suggestibility, and bias are not simple lapses. They are the brain doing precisely what it is designed to do, but doing it in ways that diverge from reality. Misattribution is perhaps the most common and least recognized of these errors. It occurs when the brain correctly remembers a piece of information, but incorrectly assigns it to the wrong source. The phenomenon known as cryptomnesia is one of its stranger manifestations. A person encounters an idea, forgets they encountered it, and later generates what feels to them like an original thought, unaware that what they are producing is a memory in disguise. Several notable musicians and writers have been caught in this pattern, not as deliberate plagiarists, but as unwitting victims of a source monitoring failure. The content of the memory survived while the context of its acquisition did not, leaving the person with a vivid sense of origination that never existed. George Harrison's 1970 song, My Sweet Lord, was the subject of a landmark copyright case, on precisely this basis, with the court eventually determining that Harrison had unconsciously reproduced the melody of the Shy Fawns. 1963, He's So Fine. Harrison himself maintained he had no awareness of borrowing it, and the court, reflecting on the nature of unconscious memory, did not find deliberate intent. The episode sits at the border between artistic influence and memory failure, and it is uncomfortable precisely because the line between them may be thinner than the legal system finds convenient. The legal implications of memory failure extend far beyond copyright. Eyewitness testimony has been the cornerstone of criminal prosecution for centuries, carrying with it an intuitive authority that is difficult to question in a courtroom. When someone takes the stand and says, calmly and with evident conviction, that they saw a particular face at a particular moment, juries tend to believe them. The research accumulated since the early 1970s suggests they probably should not believe them nearly as readily as they do. Elizabeth Loftus, now a distinguished professor at the University of California, Irvine, began her career studying the malleability of memory in the years immediately following her graduate training. And the experiments she and her colleagues conducted over the following decades rewrote the foundational assumptions of forensic psychology, even if those assumptions have proved stubbornly resistant to change in actual practice. In one of her earliest and most influential experiments, Loftus showed participants a short film of a traffic accident and then asked them questions about what they had seen. Some participants were asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other. Others were asked the same question, but with the word hit replacing smashed. The group that received the word smashed gave consistently higher speed estimates, and when tested a week later, they were also significantly more likely to report having seen broken glass in the film. Even though there was no broken glass, a single word embedded in a post-event question had altered what participants believed they had witnessed. The misinformation had not merely changed their verbal reports. It had changed the memory itself, or at least what the memory produced when retrieved. Subsequent experiments made the case even more starkly. In the famous Lost in the Mall study, conducted by Loftus and her student Jacqueline Pickrell in the mid-1990s, participants were given brief written descriptions of 4 childhood events, 3 of which were real events provided by family members, and 1 of which was entirely fabricated, a scenario in which the participant had become lost in a shopping mall at around the age of 5 and been rescued by a kind elderly stranger. There was no such event in any participant's history, and yet, in the study's final interview, roughly a quarter of the participants reported partial or complete memories of the fabricated mall episode, and several elaborated upon it with sensory and emotional details that no one had supplied. When later told that one of the 4 descriptions had been invented, many participants initially chose one of the real events as the fabricated one, expressing genuine confidence that the mall memory was authentic. The implications were not lost on the researchers or on the legal system, though the latter took considerably longer to absorb them. What the mall study demonstrated was not simply that people can be tricked into accepting a false premise. It demonstrated that the imagination, when engaged with a false narrative, generates something neurologically similar to genuine episodic memory. Neuroimaging studies conducted in the following years began to explain why. When participants retrieve both true memories and certain false memories, the patterns of brain activation are strikingly similar. The same regions of the prefrontal cortex, the same hippocampal engagement, the same subjective sense of mental time travel that characterizes genuine recollection. The brain, in other words, does not reliably tag its own outputs as real or constructed. The feeling of remembering and the feeling of imagining can, under the right conditions, become indistinguishable. This has consequences that reach well beyond the laboratory. Across the United States, the Innocence Project, a legal advocacy organization founded in 1992 by attorneys Barry Skeck and Peter Neufeld, has worked to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals using DNA evidence. As of the mid-2020s, the project and its affiliates had contributed to more than 375 exonerations. Eyewitness misidentification has been a contributing factor in approximately 70% of those cases, a figure so consistent and so large that it cannot be dismissed as an anomaly. These were not cases in which witnesses lied. In most of them, the witnesses were entirely sincere. They pointed to the wrong person with the full force of genuine conviction because their memories, shaped by suggestive identification procedures, by the passage of time, by the stress of the event, and by the confirmation they received from investigators, had reconstructed the wrong face into the role of perpetrator with complete subjective authenticity. The Stephen Avery case, the Ronald Cotton case, the wrongful conviction of Jennifer Thompson's rapist. These are not cautionary tales about dishonest witnesses. They are case studies in the ordinary, predictable malfunction of a memory system that was never designed to operate with forensic precision. Jennifer Thompson, a college student in 1984 who was raped at knife point in her apartment in North Carolina, memorized her attacker's face with deliberate, courageous attention during the assault, determined to identify him later. She did identify him with complete confidence through a police lineup, but she identified the wrong man. Ronald Cotton was convicted on the strength of her testimony and spent more than 10 years in prison before DNA evidence identified the true perpetrator. When Thompson and Cotton later met and later wrote a book together about the experience, the account they produced was not simply a legal story. It was a meditation on what memory does to two people whose lives are bound together by an error neither of them made intentionally. The question that persists through all of this is not whether memory fails, that is now settled, but why it feels so real when it does. The answer lies in what cognitive scientists call the phenomenology of remembering, the cluster of subjective qualities that accompany memory retrieval and give it the sense of being grounded in actual experience. When you remember something vividly, you experience what researchers call autonoetic consciousness, a sense of mental time travel in which you seem to be re-experiencing the past as a witness to it, with a felt sense of, I was there. This quality of remembering is normally associated with genuine episodic memory, and it is the quality that makes eyewitness testimony feel so compelling to juries. The problem is that it can accompany false memories with equal, sometimes greater, intensity. Some research suggests that emotional arousal, the very thing that ought to make a memory more reliable, by fixing it more firmly in the brain, can under certain conditions make memory more susceptible to subsequent distortion, not less. This runs counter to everything ordinary intuition says about memory. We tend to believe that traumatic or emotionally vivid events are the ones we remember most accurately, because they are the ones we have reviewed and re-examined most often. But that repeated review is precisely the mechanism through which distortion accumulates. Each time a memory is retrieved, it enters what neuroscientists call the reconsolidation window, a brief period during which the memory trace is labile, plastic, and susceptible to modification before it is restabilized. Post-event information, emotional reinterpretation, social suggestion, the questions we are asked, the stories we tell ourselves, all of these can enter the memory during reconsolidation and become incorporated into what is stored. The event and the post-event narrative merge until the brain can no longer distinguish which is which, because at the neural level, the distinction has literally ceased to exist. This is where the science intersects with something more philosophically troubling. Not just the question of whether individual memories are accurate, but the question of whether the self, which is in large part constituted by its memories, is as stable and continuous as it feels. If the memories that define a person's history are partly reconstructed, partly updated, partly shaped by social narrative and emotional need, then the identity that depends on those memories is also, to some degree, a construction. This is not a nihilistic conclusion. It does not mean that personal identity is meaningless or that history is fictional, but it does mean that the relationship between the self and its own past is more dynamic, more mediated, and more uncertain than any of us are habitually willing to acknowledge. The cultural manifestation of this discomfort is visible in the phenomenon known as the Mandela effect, named, with some historical imprecision, after Nelson Mandela, whom a surprisingly large number of people claim to remember dying in South African prison in the 1980s. He did not. He was released from prison in 1990, became the first democratically elected president of South Africa in 1994, and died in December 2013. And yet the false memory of his prison death persists in wide circulation, supplemented by similarly robust false memories of the Monopoly Man wearing a monocle he never possessed, of the children's book series, the Berenstain Bears being spelled Berenstein, and of numerous other small but vivid errors in collective cultural memory. The online communities that have gathered around these shared false memories have, in many cases, developed elaborate explanatory frameworks, including the suggestion that parallel universes are somehow involved, that serve primarily to protect the feeling of certainty from the evidence that would undermine it. That protective impulse itself is worth attending to. The refusal to accept that one's memory could be simply, ordinarily wrong reveals how much is psychologically invested in the reliability of one's own internal record.